Mr. Vice. My name is Will. I'm a junior at the college. My question is, in retrospect, do you believe that the United States should have acted earlier in Syria, and if not, why is now the right moment?
No. Maybe I can ask staff to help.
It's working.
Turn this one on, but I'll use it in the meantime. Is this working? There we go, okay. The answer is no for two reasons. One, the idea of identifying a moderate middle has been a chase America has been engaged in for a long time. We Americans think in every country in transition there's a Thomas Jefferson hiding behind some rock or a James Madison beyond one sand dune. The fact of the matter is the ability to identify a moderate middle in Syria there was no moderate middle, because the moderate middle are made up of shopkeepers, not soldiers. They're made up of people who, in fact, were ordinary elements of the middle class of that country. And what happened was, and their history will record this, because I'm finding that former administration officials, as soon as they leave, write books, which I think is inappropriate. But at any rate, no, I'm serious. I do think it's inappropriate. At least, give the guy a chance to get out of office. What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Now, you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, work with al-Nusra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them. So what happened? Now all of a sudden, I don't want to be too facetious, but they have seen the Lord. Now the president's been able to put together a coalition of our Sunni neighbors, because America can't once again go in to a Muslim nation and be the aggressor. It has to be led by Sunnis to go and attack a Sunni organization. And so what do we have for the first time? Now Saudi Arabia has stopped the funding going in. Saudi Arabia is allowing training on its soil of American forces under Title X open training. The Qataris have cut off their support for the most extreme elements of the terrorist organizations. And the Turks, President Erdogan told me, he's an old friend, said, you were right, we let too many people through. Now they're trying to seal their border. So this idea that somehow it was within our power early on in this process, and there were a couple former members of the administration who were arguing we should give, quote, the opposition, which we couldn't identify as moderate, by the way, I'm serious about that, give them ground-to-air launch missiles. Can you imagine what would have happened if that had been done? Does anybody doubt they would have been in the hands of al-Nusra or al-Qaeda or Khorasan Group or ISIL? There's a difference between, it's good to be both tough and smart. They're a pair that's required. So now what's happened is everyone in the region has awakened. And now under U.S. leadership, the coalition has been put together, and they're moving. You notice what Turkey did today. What Erdogan told me last Thursday he would do. asked me not to say anything until it was voted on. They voted in the Turkish parliament to allow Turkish ground forces in to take on ISIL. Turkish airspace be able to be used by NATO and by other allies. Turkish airspace be able to accommodate our drones. So this idea that there was an option there is fiction. It did not exist. We could have poured, if we could find every moderate we could find, and by the way, now it's public, we have been training moderate forces. But we've been very select in making sure who they were and vetting them. And now the number is classified, but there are more than several thousand in country now, and there will be more. But it's absolute fiction to suggest that early on, if we had just acted more quickly. It took Saudi Arabia to figure out ISIL's objective wasn't Ramadi, it was Mecca and Medina. It took a while for the Iranians to realize the existential threat to Iran was a radical Sunni extremist terrorist group. It took a while for Turkey, a Sunni nation, to figure out that ISIL was a direct, immediate threat to their well-being. It took a little while for Russia to figure out that all those Chechens that are making their way to eastern Syria, going back to Chechnya, is not a good thing. So now we have a coalition, but it's still going to be a hell of a long fight. A hell of a long fight, but it cannot be, even if we wanted to, it cannot be our fight alone. This cannot be turned into a U.S. ground war against another Arab nation in the Middle East. Hope that answers the question.
Next question.
I can do yes or no. I can do some more. No, I can do some more. Go, whoever you say.
Next
Dean.
one right up here.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My name is Max Liebeskin. I'm a sophomore at the college. You spoke a lot about human rights in your speech, and so I want to ask you a little bit more about that.
Sure.
So I think essentially your argument was that human rights is really at the core of American foreign policy and that we're unique in that sense. But currently in our strikes against ISIS, we're working with Saudi Arabia. I think 8 people were beheaded in Saudi Arabia in August. We're working with Qatar, a country that to some extent more or less allows slave labor. And so I think that when you look at the full breadth of the evidence, to say that we're really consistently influenced by human rights isn't necessarily supported. And so my question for you is twofold. How do you think that human rights does influence U.S. policy, and how do you think that it should?
I think human rights influence U.S. policy in us making it known whether we're working with a country that's in our interest or against our interest, what the limits are that we believe are proper conduct. We have made it clear to the Saudis we do not at all condone their beheadings. We made it clear to them that we do not agree with the way they proceed. We don't agree with the way they treat women. I could go on and on and on. But it's a little bit like, and I know you don't mean this, I'm being a little facetious. All generalizations are false, including this one I'm about to make. It's a little bit like saying, we should have never cooperated with Stalin to defeat the Nazis. We knew Stalin was a no-good SOB from the very beginning. No, for real. I mean, we did. There was no illusions. Millions of Russians had been killed. We knew. But there's a thing called self-interest. And it is overwhelming the interest of everyone, including the Saudis, and maybe alter their behavior ultimately, if we in fact eliminate and or do great damage to this perversion, this perverse group called ISIL that is giving, and part of the thing we're doing now with ISIL, it's not merely using air power and organizing military alliances. What we're doing is we're spending an incredible amount of time and talking to our Saudi friends, quote unquote, and our Turkish friends and others, to delegitimize ISIL as a religious-based organization. And that's why for the first time there's over 120 imams of major denominations across the world that are condemning ISIL, taking away their legitimacy to respond and act in the region by pointing out that they're perverting Islam. So part of this is to discredit this organization. There's other things we're doing as well. But my generic point is that you are hardly ever in a circumstance where there is something that you choose an ally in an area that shares every one of your values. But that does not mean we remain silent with Saudi Arabia. We have not remained silent with Saudi Arabia. And I certainly haven't remained silent with Saudi Arabia. You were very polite introducing me, but sometimes I say controversial things. I think Frank may admit to this. I don't think anyone ever doubt I mean what I say. The problem is I sometimes say all that I mean. And I got to make sure not to do that right now. Anyway, it's a good question, kiddo, and it's legitimate. It's legitimate. But I would argue it's not inconsistent to look out for your self-interest while as long as you at the same time are making clear to the ally at the moment that you, in fact, do not agree with what we perceive to be their violation of human rights.
Next question right up here.
Hi, Mr. Vice President. My name is Asaramo Okolo. I'm a sophomore at the college. I'm also membership director of the Harvard College Democrats. On behalf of the Dems across
The answer's
campus, we want to welcome you and say that we love you a lot.
Well, that's very nice.
But as young Democrats, we understand the urgency and importance of a strong and firm foreign policy plan. But as we prepare to take the reins of leadership, we also see Ferguson, we see the crumbling immigration system that you mentioned, and we see a Congress that really hasn't worked for many years. And so instead of asking you one more time what your plan is, we want to know what your advice is for us, your Democrats, as we step forward.
I think it's a really good question. I just spent an hour in my sister's class with her students speaking to that very question. So I'll try to summarize this in 3 minutes. Number one, the situation in Ferguson is terrible, but the progress we've made is overwhelming in the United States of America. It pales in comparison to anything. It doesn't mean what happened is not as vile as what happened in my generation in the civil rights movement, which I come out of, but it is a fundamentally different world. And so what we have to do is we have to keep making the case. Keep making the case for transparency. Keep holding people accountable when they violate the rights of other individuals. And we have to continue to make the case that for civil rights and civil liberties in this country. But we are so far beyond where you would have been apoplectic in my generation. With Swerner and so, number one, put this in perspective. The individual occurrence is horrible. Like, for example, the murder rate is down, but if your family member is murdered, it doesn't matter whether the murder rate is 0 but for that single murder. It doesn't matter. But looking at the nation as a whole, there has been overwhelming progress, and that's why we have to continue to fight. Case in point, there have been an ancillary aspect of that. 81 pieces of legislation introduced in state legislative bodies to curtail the right to vote. This fight is never over. It's like cutting grass. Oh, no, I really mean it. You cut your grass early in the summer, it looks great. Let it go for a week, it still looks good. A month gets raggy. Let it go all summer, you got a little jungle. I really mean it. You have to cut the grass constantly. Constantly, constantly, constantly. And that's where you all come in. With regard to the dysfunctional Congress, the Congress is, look, people say the United States is a divided nation. We're not a divided nation, for God's sake. And every single major issue, go back to your political science classes, look at the polling data. Every issue, from minimum wage to marriage equality to major economic issues on taxes, etc. Look at them all, the 9 major issues. The American people have a consensus from 53% to 74% agreeing on every one of those issues. What's changed are the political parties. I was joking with Frank, who I really respect, and he knows I do. We used to fight like hell. But we never questioned one another's motive. We questioned each other's judgment. I got there in 72, and the old segregationists were still there in the Democratic caucus. James O. Easton, Herman Talmadge, that whole crowd. No, I'm serious. I'm serious. I got there, and I ran as a kid out of the civil rights movement. I was no great shakes, but desegregating movie theaters engaged in the civil rights efforts. And I sat in a caucus with nine people who, by any other standard, would be called racist in the Democratic caucus. And I watched my friend, he became my dear friend, Teddy Kennedy. I'd watch him get up, and I remember bitter arguments between he and Eastland in the renewal of the Voting Rights Act. Yet they'd leave the floor and have a cup of coffee together. They went after each other's judgment. They didn't go after motive. What's happening today? Frank will tell you. I bet he tells it in his classes. Today, we go after people's motives, which is absolutely corrosive. Remember I said to you, or I didn't, I said it in Valerie's class, never try to, improve on Tip O'Neill, who said all politics is local. But I'm old enough now to be able to improve on it, or attempt to. I believe all politics is personal. It's personal. And when I attack your integrity, your motive, it's different than attacking your judgment, because you can overcome on a personal basis my disagreement with your judgment. But it pollutes the relationship. It poisons it when I make it personal. And you cannot, in this country, as diverse as we are, govern this country without consensus. And the one way to make sure consensus cannot be arrived at is go after your motive. I learned a very important lesson when I was a 31-year-old kid. I didn't want to go to the United States Senate after my wife and daughter were killed. And I mean that sincerely. My sister will tell you, other people can tell you, John Martilla can tell you. My brother went to the governor-elect to determine who would take my place because I wasn't going to be sworn in. I wouldn't even go down to be sworn in. They sent a secretary of the Senate because they were I'd changed my mind up to the hospital where my sons were and swore me in because they were afraid, the Democrats were afraid I wouldn't keep the commitment to come for 6 months. And every week, once a week on Thursday at 3 o'clock, I'd go to see the majority leader, a man of great integrity. And any older Republicans here, Democrats can tell you, his name was Mike Mansfield, an incredible gentleman. And he'd call me in and he'd give me an assignment once a week. And I was so stupid, I thought every freshman got an assignment. No, I really did. I was 29 years old, kid. I'm the first United States Senator I ever knew. And so it wasn't like, seriously. I'm not joking. Anyway, so what happened was I'd go in and he'd give me an assignment, but I later learned he was just taking my pulse to see how I was doing because I didn't want to be there. I wanted to get out and go home to my kids who were still hospitalized. And one day I walked in and I'd walk in and I'd walk through the Senate floor. If you ever watch on C-SPAN, the senators come in those side double doors and walk down the aisle and vote. Well, I'd always walk in on the way to see Mansfield, his office on the other side, to get a sense when the last vote was going to be for the day, what train I could catch to go home. So I'm walking through, Maggie, and I walk in, and Jesse Helms, who got elected the same year I did, was excoriating Bob Dole, a guy named Marlowe Cook, a Republican from Kentucky, and Teddy Kennedy for their support of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it seemed vile to me. And I walked in and I sat down in front of Mansfield's desk, which I always did, and he looked at me, he talked in clipped tones, and said, "Joe, what's the problem? You look upset." And I said, "Well, Mr. President, I just listened to Jesse Helms. That guy has no social redeeming value. I was really angry." He said, "Joe, Joe, what would you say to me if I told you that 2 years ago, Dot Helms and Jesse Helms, that's his wife, were sitting in their living room a month before Christmas, first week in December." Thank you, Dee. And there was an ad in the Raleigh Observer, and And there was a picture of a young boy, 10 years old, in braces up to his hips, saying, all I want for Christmas is to belong to a family. That's all I want. And I said, what would you say if I told you Jesse and Dot Helms went down and adopted that young man? I said, Mr. Leader, I'd feel like a jerk. He said, well, he did. And then he said to me, Joe, I have found it's never useful to presume you know another man's motive. Question is judgment, never is motive. I think Frank could tell you, or other Republicans, sir, I've never once in my career questioned another man or woman's motive. I've gone after their judgment like the hammers of hell when I've disagreed, but never their judgment. Never their judgment. Is this a very important lesson. Today, all we do is attack one another's judgment. Never their motive, always their judgment. But think of how we do it today. It's put in personal terms. You're bad. You're not a Christian. You're indecent. Or whatever the devil it is. And it's corrosive on the body politic. And that's where you guys come in. You got to get involved. Because this too will change. This will change. There's nothing wrong with the American people. The system is being abused, from the filibuster to the use of gerrymandering and all the rest. But they are all soluble problems. Remember, to paraphrase Plato, the penalty good people pay for not being involved in politics is being governed by people worse than themselves. Not a joke. You have no one to blame for yourself. You all have a serious disadvantage. You are bright, you are informed, and you know better. Yes.